My brother-in-law falsely accused me of seducing him. My family kicked me out without listening. But when my grandfather died, his will revealed who was telling the truth, and left my parents broke and begging for forgiveness. I'm 23 years old, studying marketing at university, and what happened like a year and a half ago basically destroyed any kind of relationship I had with my parents. The truth is that to this day, I can't believe how things got. Like, one completely false accusation, and suddenly, my whole life went to hell right before my final exams. I guess I should start at the beginning, when my grandfather was still alive and my family at least pretended to be functional. I was always the second daughter, you know, the one who's never enough. My sister, Stephanie, who's like 4 years older than me, was always the golden child, the perfect one, the one who did everything right according to my parents. She married Joshua when I was about 18, and he seemed like a decent guy at first. Worked in finance or something, always well-dressed and polite. My parents adored him, obviously, because he came from a family with money and that was the only thing that really mattered to them. I never had much of the relationship with him. I mean, he was my brother-in-law and that's it. I'd see him at family dinners and that was that. My parents were always super strict and controlling, the kind where everything has to be perfect for the neighbors and extended family. My mom is one of those who worries more about what people will think than about how her own children feel. You know what I mean? And my dad is the same. Everything is appearances and status. I went to college when I was 19, got a partial scholarship because my grades were good, but still my parents helped me with expenses, which meant they had control over basically everything I did. They'd call me 2 or 3 times a week asking who I was going out with, what I was doing, if I was studying enough, everything. At that time, I had a boyfriend, Eric, who was studying in another city, so our relationship was long distance. My parents didn't know him much because we'd only seen each other in person like 3 times, but they knew he existed. Eric was super good to me. He supported me a lot with my studies and was always there when I needed to talk, even at 2 in the morning when I was stressing about exams. Everything changed in December 2023, just 2 weeks before my finals for the semester. I remember it was a Tuesday, like around 9 at night, and I was in my apartment studying for a statistics exam I had on Friday. My phone rang, and it was my mom, which was weird because she normally called me on Sundays. I answered, and literally the first thing she said was, "We need you to come to the house right now." And when I asked her why, she just said, "You'll see when you get here," with a voice I'd never heard from her before, like cold and furious at the same time. I drove like an hour to my parents' house with my stomach in knots because I knew something bad was happening, but I had no idea what. When I got there, my parents were in the living room, my dad pacing back and forth and my mom sitting on the couch with her, arms crossed. Stephanie and Joshua were also there, and Stephanie was crying. My first reaction was to think that someone had died or something, but then my dad saw me and literally exploded. He yelled at me about how I dared to do what I had done, that I was shameless, that I had dishonored the family, and I was standing there like, "What the hell are you talking about?" I tried to ask him what was wrong, but he wouldn't let me speak. He kept yelling things about Joshua and text messages, and I don't know what else. Finally, my mom took out her phone and showed me screenshots of supposed messages between Joshua and me, super suggestive messages, where I supposedly told him things like I liked him and that Stephanie didn't have to know, horrible things that I never, ever, had written. I told them those messages were fake, that I had never sent anything like that to Joshua, that we didn't even have that kind of relationship. But my parents didn't believe me. Joshua was sitting there in silence, with a victim face. And when I tried to confront him, he just said he was sorry things had gotten that far, but that I had started everything. Can you believe it? The guy was framing me for something he had obviously made up, and my own parents believed him instead of me. I tried to explain to them that someone had manipulated those conversations or that Joshua had fabricated them, but my dad told me I had 10 minutes to pack my things and get out of his house. Stephanie just cried and looked at me with disgust. My mom told me I was a liar and that she couldn't believe I had tried to destroy my sister's marriage. The situation was so surreal that part of me thought I was going to wake up and it would all be a nightmare. But no, it was real. I had nowhere to go. I mean, my apartment was an hour away and it was like 11 at night already. I called Eric crying and he told me to go to a hotel and that he'd help me with whatever. But then I remembered my grandparents. They lived like 20 minutes from my parents' house, So I drove there with my hands shaking so much I almost went off the road twice. My grandparents, especially my grandfather, were always my favorite people in the world. My grandfather was one of those wise and calm men who never judged without hearing both sides of the story. When I got to their house and told them what had happened, my grandmother hugged me and told me to stay with them as long as I needed. My grandfather got serious, looked me in the eyes, and asked me if what my parents were saying was true. I told him no, that I would never do something like that, and he believed me immediately. He said something like, "I've known you since you were born, and I know what kind of person you are." And that was enough for him. I spent the night in my grandparents' guest room, not sleeping at all, thinking about how I was going to take my final exams in 2 weeks, with this whole situation on top of me. The next day, my dad called my grandparents. I don't. I know how he found out I was there, and demanded that they kick me out too. My grandfather told him that wasn't going to happen, that I was his granddaughter and that I would always have a place in his house. My dad got furious and told them that if they supported me, then he would never speak to them again, that they had to choose between their son or their lying granddaughter. My grandfather, with that calm that characterized him, responded with something like, "If that's your decision, then so be it. But I'm not going to abandon my granddaughter when she needs me most." And he hung up the phone. I was there listening to everything and I felt horrible. Like, I had just caused a fight between my dad and my grandparents over something I hadn't even done. My grandmother told me not to worry, that they knew who their children were and that my dad had always been stubborn and materialistic. I stayed with my grandparents and managed to take my finals, though not as well as I would have wanted, because obviously I couldn't concentrate. Eric came to visit me during winter break and that helped me a lot. It was basically the only good thing about those months. My grandparents received him super well, and I think my grandfather appreciated that someone was supporting me when my own family had turned their backs on me. Then something happened that nobody expected. In February, like 2 months after the whole situation, my grandfather had a heart attack. It was super sudden, like, he was fine one day and the next day he was gone. He died in the hospital before we could even say goodbye properly. I was devastated. I had just lost the only person in my family who had really supported me when everyone else turned their backs on me. The funeral was super weird. A lot of relatives came. Uncles, cousins, people I hadn't seen in years. But my parents didn't show up. My mom sent a message saying they were out of town and couldn't get back in time, which sounded strange, but I was so devastated that I didn't even pay much attention to it at the time. Stephanie didn't come either, supposedly because she had to stay with Joshua, who was sick or something. Like a week after the funeral, my parents showed up at my grandmother's house. I was there helping her organize Grandpa's things when they knocked on the door. My dad came in with this attitude like superiority, telling me that they had thought a lot about the situation and that they were willing to forgive me if I admitted what I had done and apologized to Stephanie and Joshua. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, are you offering me forgiveness for something I didn't do? I told them I had nothing to admit because I was innocent, and my mom started with how if I didn't accept their offer, then they were going to completely disinherit me. That's when I realized something. They hadn't come to offer me forgiveness out of kindness or because they missed me. They came because they thought they were going to inherit something from Grandpa and wanted to make sure I didn't interfere. It was so obvious in retrospect. The way my dad kept asking about Grandpa's papers and if they had already talked to the lawyer. Turns out my grandfather had updated his will like a month before he died, something nobody knew except my grandmother and Raymond, who was my grandfather's lawyer and also his friend for like 40 years. In the will, Grandpa left the house to my grandmother, obviously, but all his savings, which were like $200,000, a huge amount considering he had worked his whole life and saved every penny, he left to me. He also had a property in Florida that he left to my parents, or so the will said. When Raymond came to officially read the will, my parents were there waiting for their share of the inheritance. The look on their faces when Raymond said all the savings were for me was priceless. Like, my dad turned red as a tomato and my mom looked like she was going to explode. They started yelling that it wasn't fair, that I had manipulated Grandpa when he was sick, that the will couldn't be valid. Raymond explained to them super calmly that the will had been made when my grandfather was perfectly lucid and that there were 2 witnesses present besides him. My mom pointed at me and told me something like, "This is what you wanted all along. That's why you played the victim with your grandfather. You manipulated him so he'd leave you everything." I was in shock. I didn't know Grandpa had left me anything. I didn't even know he had that much money saved. I told her I didn't know anything about the will, and my grandmother confirmed it was true, that Grandpa had done everything in secret because he wanted to protect me. My parents decided to contest the will in court. They hired a lawyer and everything, spending who knows how much money, trying to prove that my grandfather wasn't in his right mind when he wrote it or that I had manipulated him. The process was horrible. I had to give testimonies and present evidence that I didn't even know about the will. Raymond was incredible during the whole process. He explained to me that my grandfather had foreseen that something like this might happen and that he had taken extra precautions to make sure the will was challenge-proof. But here comes the crazy part. Apparently, my grandfather had put a special clause in the will that said that if anyone tried to contest it, that person would automatically trigger a second part of the will. The Florida property that my parents were going to inherit wasn't just a property. It was a property with massive debts, like back taxes, municipal fines, everything. My grandfather had bought that property years ago when it was in trouble and never sold it precisely because he knew it was worth less than the debts associated with it. By contesting the will, my parents activated the clause that made that property transfer to them immediately, with all its debts included. Raymond explained this to them in court, and my dad's face was unbelievable. They literally ended up with a property that was worth like $80,000 but had debts of $150,000. The judge dismissed their case because the will was perfectly drafted and legal, and besides now my parents had to deal with a property that was basically a financial hole. My grandfather had basically set a trap for them in case they ever showed their true greedy nature. And it worked perfectly. After the judge gave his ruling, my parents tried to declare bankruptcy or something to avoid the property debts, but it turns out my grandfather had also structured everything in such a way that they couldn't just get rid of it without paying. It was brilliant and terrible at the same time, because even though it was exactly what they deserved, it also meant that any possibility of reconciliation was completely dead. During the following months, my parents and Stephanie tried several times to contact me. My mom would send me messages telling me she forgave me for putting them in that situation, as if I had anything to do with my grandfather's decisions. Stephanie called me crying, telling me we were sisters and that family should be united. But when I asked her if she believed me about Joshua, she just stayed silent and changed the subject. I was so angry and hurt that I blocked their numbers for a while. I used part of the money I inherited to pay for the rest of my college and save the rest. My grandmother didn't want me to give her anything. She said Grandpa had left it specifically for me, and that she had enough with her pension and the house. Eric and I were still together. He graduated that year and found a job in my city, so we could finally be in the same city, which was amazing after so much drama. Things got crazier like 6 months after the trial. Stephanie showed up at my grandmother's house one day, alone, crying. At first I thought she was coming to ask me for money or something, but no. Turns out she had discovered that Joshua was cheating on her, and not only that, he had been cheating on her for years, since before all the drama with the fake messages happened. Stephanie had found Joshua's phone unlocked and saw messages with another woman. Messages that went back like 2 years. When she confronted Joshua, he initially denied everything, but Stephanie kept investigating and found something that left her frozen. Joshua had saved his mistress's number on his phone under my name. Literally, the messages that my parents had shown me that day when they accused me were real, but they weren't with me, they were with his mistress. Joshua had changed the contact name to my name, probably edited some things to make it look like I was the one sending him those messages, and had used that to cover up his affair and get rid of me in the process, because I had started noticing weird things in his behavior at family gatherings. Stephanie was destroyed. She apologized to me through tears, telling me she should have believed me, that I was her sister, and that she had screwed up horribly by not being on my side. I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to yell at her that she had turned her back on me when I needed her most, but another part saw how broken she was and felt sorry. I asked her why it had taken her so long to realize, and she admitted that she had started to suspect months ago but was afraid of the truth, afraid to admit that she had ruined her relationship with me for a man who was worthless. My grandmother hugged her and told her she could stay at the house as long as she needed. Stephanie separated from Joshua that same week, moved in with my grandmother, and started the divorce process. My parents were furious when they found out, not because they cared that Joshua had been unfaithful to Stephanie, but because Joshua came from a family with money, and the divorce meant that Stephanie would lose access to those resources. My dad went to my grandmother's house to yell at Stephanie that she was being dramatic and that all men make mistakes, that she should try to save her marriage. My grandmother, who never raised her voice, literally yelled at my dad to get out of her house and not come back until he could behave like a decent father. It was the first time I saw my grandmother really angry, and I think my dad was surprised too because he left without saying anything else. A few weeks later, my parents threw Joshua out of their house because he had moved in with them when Stephanie left him. Incredible, right? Apparently, Joshua had tried to ask them for money to pay for his divorce. Lawyer and my parents, who were already broke from the Florida property, told him they had nothing to give him. Joshua yelled at them that he had done everything they asked, including fabricating the messages to get rid of me, and that now they owed him. My dad realized in that moment that they had destroyed their relationship with me and my grandparents based on the lies of a guy who had only been using them all along. He came to my grandmother's house a few days later, just him, and apologized to my grandmother for everything. He didn't apologize to me directly. I think he was too ashamed or didn't know how. But he told my grandmother that he accepted that he wouldn't receive anything from Grandpa and that he understood why he had done it. My mom, on the other hand, still doesn't admit they were wrong. The last time I talked to her, she told me something like, "We all made mistakes in that situation," as if what they did to me was equivalent to anything I could have done. I don't think she'll ever change. She's too stuck in her world of appearances and status to admit she was a horrible mother. My grandmother told Stephanie recently that when she dies, the house will be for Stephanie, because Stephanie is trying to rebuild her life and needs stability. I told my grandmother that seemed perfect to me, that I don't need the house, and that Stephanie deserves to have something after everything she went through. Stephanie is seeing a therapist now, trying to process everything she lived through in her marriage and how her relationship with Joshua manipulated her into turning away from me. She and I are rebuilding our relationship slowly. It's not easy. There are still days where I remember how she looked at me that day when they accused me, and it hurts. But I also see that she's a victim of Joshua as much as I am, just in a different way. We go out for coffee sometimes. We talk about superficial things mainly. We avoid talking about our parents because that topic only causes tension. Eric and I are still together. In fact, we moved in together like 3 months ago. He's been my rock through all of this. He never doubted me for a second. My grandmother adores him, says he's the grandson she never had, which is kind of sad but also sweet. I finished my degree last year, with good grades despite all the drama, got a job at a marketing agency, and honestly, things are good in that aspect of my life. Sometimes I think about everything that happened, and I can't believe that my own family abandoned me so easily, based on lies. My parents chose to believe Joshua, a guy they barely really knew, instead of their own daughter. They chose money and appearances over the truth. And the craziest thing is that if it hadn't been for my grandfather, I'd probably still be treated as the villain of the family. My grandfather knew exactly what kind of people my parents were. That's why he structured his will that way. It wasn't just to protect me. It was to teach them a lesson about greed and the consequences of their actions. Sometimes I wonder if he knew something, like what happened with Joshua was going to happen, if he saw the signs that I didn't see. I'll probably never know, but I'm eternally grateful to him for trusting me when nobody else did. And Stephanie's divorce process is going well? Her lawyer says it'll probably be done in the next few months. Joshua is apparently trying to fight for half of everything, but Stephanie has proof of his infidelity, and that helps her case a lot. My parents are still dealing with the debts from the Florida property. I think they're trying to sell it, but nobody wants to buy something that comes with so many problems. In a way, they're still paying for the decisions they made that day, when they kicked me out of their house. The last time I saw my dad was like 2 weeks ago, at the supermarket. We crossed paths in the cereal aisle and we both froze for a second. He looked older, tired, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something, but he just nodded and kept walking. I don't know what to feel about it. Part of me misses having parents, having that complete family I had before, but another part knows that family was never real. It was just a facade that crumbled as soon as things got difficult. My grandmother tells me that time heals everything, but I'm not sure I believe that completely. There are things that don't heal. You just learn to live with them. I learned that the family you choose is sometimes more important than blood family. I learned that appearances mean nothing if there's no real love and trust behind them. And I learned that some people, no matter how much you share with them by blood, will never choose you over money or status. A few days ago, Stephanie asked me if I could ever completely forgive our parents. I told her that honestly I didn't know, that maybe someday, but that forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or blindly trusting again. She understood. I think she's going through a similar process regarding Joshua and how she behaved herself during all that time. My grandmother turned 75 this year and is planning a small celebration. She's going to invite some relatives, but not my parents. She asked me if it would bother me if she invited my dad, but not my mom, because he at least tried to apologize to her. But I told her it was her birthday, and she should invite whoever she wanted. The truth is, I don't know if I'm ready to see them in a family environment again. It still makes me anxious to think about being in the same room with them. Eric asked me the other day if I regretted going to my grandparents' house that night, instead of just staying in a hotel and cutting contact with everyone. I told him no, because even though the last year and a half was hell, at least now I know who the people are who really love me unconditionally. I lost my parents in the process, basically. But I gained clarity about who I am and what kind of relationships I want in my life. Sometimes I look at the $200,000 in my bank account, well, minus what I spent on college, and I think it's blood, tears, and decades of my grandfather's hard work. I don't really see it as my money. I see it as his way of making sure I was okay when he was no longer here. It's my responsibility to use it wisely, to honor his memory by being the person he knew I was, not the person my parents wanted to make me believe I was. Stephanie told me recently that she admired how I had handled everything, that she wouldn't have been as strong in my position. I told her I didn't feel strong at all, that there were days where I still cried thinking about everything I lost. But I guess moving forward despite everything is its own form of strength, even if it doesn't feel that way in the moment. The other day, I found a letter that my grandfather had left me with Raymond, the lawyer. Apparently, he was supposed to give it to me after the will was completely resolved. In the letter, my grandfather told me that if I was reading this, it meant his worst suspicions about my parents were true, and that he regretted not being able to protect me better when he was alive. He said he had known me since I was a baby and always knew I was genuine and good-hearted, and that I should never doubt my worth no matter what others said about me. I cried for like an hour after reading that letter. I don't know what's going to happen with my family in the future. Maybe someday my parents will really understand what they did and apologize for real, not just with empty words but with actions that show they changed. Maybe it'll never happen. Stephanie and I probably will never be as close as we were as kids, but at least we're trying to build something new. And my grandmother, well, she's still my anchor, the person who reminds me that I deserve unconditional love. Eric proposed to me last month. He said he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me, that he had seen the worst of my family situation, and that only made him more sure that I was the person he wanted to be with. I said yes, obviously, but I asked him to wait a bit before planning the wedding because I'm still processing everything. He understood. As always, my grandmother was the first person we told about the engagement. She was super happy, cried a little, and said my grandfather would have adored Eric. I think she's right. Stephanie was also very happy when she found out. She hugged me and told me I deserved to be happy. It was a nice moment. One of those rare moments where I felt that maybe, just maybe, things are going to be okay eventually. There are still bad days. Days where I get angry about everything I lost, about the years of relationship with my parents that I'll never get back, about the lost time with Stephanie. But there are also good days. Days where I wake up next to Eric and think that despite everything, I built a life I like, with people who value me for who I really am. Last week, my grandmother showed me an old photo of my grandfather and me when I was like 5 years old. We were in his garden. He was teaching me to plant tomatoes, and we were both smiling. She told me to keep that photo, that it would help me remember that there was always someone who believed in me without conditions. I have it now on my desk at work, and every time I have a difficult day, I look at it and it reminds me why I keep going. I don't know if this story has a happy ending in the traditional sense. My parents and I basically have no relationship. We probably never will again. But I have my grandmother, Stephanie, who's trying to be better, Eric, who loves me, and the memory of a grandfather who protected me even after his death. And that, I guess, has to be enough.